Well, I always say that today for me is sort of like, World Series, Super Bowl, World Cup, kind of all wrapped up into one, right? This is our big day. I remember when I was in high school, I was a quarterback on the football team, and before the big game, for any big game, I would get nervous, and I'd be in the locker room, and I'd go into the bathroom, and I'd throw up before a big day. I didn't throw up this morning. Because back then, my left side of my line it was called the weak side of the line. And I think it's going to be a debate the rest of our lives. Quick side, weak side. I think it was called I'll call it the quick side today for you, Pete. No, but today's a big day. And so, how do you, I talked about this last week, how do you come, every single Easter with a new message or something fresh about the Easter story? And so I decided to do just a two-part series. We're calling it Epic Love. So I was thinking about today, and I was thinking about, we didn't have service during the weekend. A friend texted me and said, "Jeff, when are your service?" I said, "Well, this year we're only doing one. We're only doing Sunday morning. A lot of times we do Friday night." Now, if you come from a different tradition, you may have even gone to service Thursday. Anybody go to service Thursday? Yeah, some people went to service on Thursday. So I'd like to start out by talking a little bit about each of these days and what they mean. Well, I could choose to talk about Good Friday. Good Friday, as you all know, is when God demonstrated his love for us, and it's all about the cross. Could have talked about the cross. We've had services here before where we'd come in and typically everything is kind of dark and there's no flowers, there's no color, right? And you talk about the cross. Or you can come in Sunday morning and talk about where you come into church Sunday morning and the flowers and bright colors and everything, because you're talking about resurrection, right? How many love to experience resurrection? Right? Like this time of year, right? Outside of our house there are these two trees, and one morning I woke up and I looked out the window and they were both bloomed. This happened overnight. Resurrection. I mean, one is this beautiful like this pink color, and the kids were out yesterday taking pictures like in front of it and everything, and it's just so beautiful. Resurrection. But in order to experience resurrection, there has to be what comes first? A death, right? And so these are two areas where it's obvious to talk about during Easter. But what I thought I'd talk about last week and this week is actually Thursday. And it's called, know what it's called? Maundy Thursday. So I don't know if you even bother to look up what that means or whatever, but that word is it's an Anglo-French word, and it comes from the Latin from mandatum, which means mandate. Mandate Thursday. And mandate is another word for commandment. And so Thursday is the day when Jesus is with his disciples and gives a new command. Interesting, he says, "A new command I give you." A new command. And he talks about love, and I'll read it here in a minute. But you have to stop and pause for a minute, and you have to think, wait a minute, a new command, wasn't it always about love? Well, I can't get into all that today, but it's worth thinking about. It's worth thinking about what exactly is the Old Testament. What exactly are the commandments in the Old Testament? But he says this, "I'm giving you a new commandment, to love each other. Just as I have loved you, you should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples." And so from that moment on, the rest of the story, the Easter story, it's God, Jesus, demonstrating that new commandment. Don't you think? It's Jesus demonstrating, showing us, right? Showing us physically, we're physical beings, what exactly that looks like. And the next day, Jesus goes to the cross. And we know that on the cross, he cries out to God. He says, "Father, forgive them." This is what is referred to in the Bible in Isaiah, and then again it's quoted in 1 Corinthians, talking about the mind of Christ. The mind of Christ. It says this actually, "For who has known the mind of the Lord, that he may instruct him?" And then it says in Corinthians, that's the quote from Isaiah, it says in Corinthians, "But we have the mind of Christ." So that's what I kind of want to talk about today, if I can. I want to talk about what exactly is the mind of Christ. When we have the mind of Christ, we will, by the very nature of the mind of Christ, agree with God's love. We will love who God loves. We will, now I'm just talking about this Easter story, we'll pay the price for reconciliation within ourselves. That's what God did for us, didn't he? He paid the price of reconciliation within himself. Now, he tells us throughout the scriptures, throughout the New Testament, then who we are. He describes us then as leaven, as salt, as the remnant or a mustard seed. And it's those things that he's referring to that God is going to use to transform the world. Now, it doesn't just mean about going to heaven, and others are not. It means in one sense that we have already arrived in heaven. It means that we begin, when we have the mind of Christ, we begin to see things differently. We begin to see things transcendently. You know what I mean by that? It means that you move past, right? You move past certain ideas and thoughts, and you transcend those ideas, and you begin to see things as they were meant to be. You begin to see things whole. You begin to see things in a healing way. Because in Galatians 2:20 it says this, it says, "I have been crucified with Christ. And it's I no longer live, but Christ that lives within me." It's interesting to me that after the resurrection, Jesus shows himself to the disciples, doesn't he? And one of the things he has to say to them is that he is not a ghost, which makes sense, right? Because they saw him crucified, they saw him die, they saw his dead body, they buried his dead body. And so because resurrection is not something that they understood. How many of you understand resurrection? They just don't get it. And so they didn't grasp resurrection. So it would be natural to think of him being some sort of ghost or some sort of spirit. And so he tells them, he says, "I am not a ghost." He said, "Look, I have flesh and bones, as you can see." And that's still almost not enough, right? Because Thomas says, I don't know. And so Jesus says, "Here, put your finger in my wounds." In my wounds. In other words, he's saying this, listen, I'm human. I'm human. Which means this. Now, this is something I want you to get. Which means to be wounded and yet resurrected at the same time. It means to be wounded and yet resurrected at the same time. And the reason why I think this is so important to us is this, is that I think sometimes we're told in a positive way from somebody's perspective, to receive Christ is to receive a life of no trouble, of no consequence, of no suffering. You know what I'm saying? This idea that if you accept Christ, everything's going to be fine. And the resurrection, in Jesus' physical resurrection, having wounds, it's this idea that, listen, even within resurrection, we will still have wounds. Jesus returns to a physical body, unlimited by space or time, without regret or recrimination. And this is an utterly counterintuitive message of the risen Jesus. I want you to know this. I want you to know that the story, the reason why I'm choosing to talk about this Maundy Thursday, this Mandate Thursday, this new commandment day, is that love, I want you to know, love is the meaning. Love's the meaning. Listen to this. This is Lady Julian of Norwich wrote this. Know it well. Love is the meaning. Who reveals this to you? Love. What does he reveal? Love. Why? For love. Remain in this and you will know more of the same. The meaning is simply love. Everything that you see, everything that we experience is about love. Someone wrote this, love, which might be called the attraction of all things toward all things. It's a universal language. My background is Polish. There's no Polish way to love over an Italian way to love, right? Over a white way to love, over a black way to love. Are you with me? It's just love. And it's so simple that it's hard to teach in words. Let me ask you a question. How many of you were taught as a young person how to fall in love with somebody? Anybody? No hands. None of us were taught how to fall in love with somebody. And yet it happens, doesn't it? And so it's such a simple thing, but it's hard to teach in words. And yet we know it when we see it. No one ever taught me how to love. Now, I want you to know something. As wonderful as human love is just the beginning. We can call it this. We can call it starter love. Now, we talked about the different words for love. The last word that we kind of left, we didn't really hit on too much, was agape love, this divine love. The other loves we spoke about. We spoke about brotherly love. We spoke about love to family. We spoke about romantic love. These loves that we experience are great. But I want you to understand they're like starter loves. It's kind of like mathematics in school, right? You don't jump into the hard mathematics. You start with simple mathematics, don't you? And you learn the simple things like addition and subtraction. Now, you learn those before you learn multiplication and division, don't you? And then you get into the more complicated mathematics, and they start to add letters to math, which that threw me right there. Anybody else? I was out. Yeah. Once they added letters to math, I didn't know how to subtract like C from G, right? And so, but my point is this. My point is that it's starter mathematics. But starter mathematics is extremely important. You can't jump right into trigonometry or calculus. You can't do it. It's the same with love. And so in a sense, our life is spent as we grow in school. Human love is starter love. Now listen, we talk about things that we love, don't we? When we say we love, certain foods. I know what kind of food you love because I see on Facebook what you post, right? The things you love. But we do. And this is okay. This is all starter love, isn't it? And we love sports. I could say I love golf. Or I love, or a woman might say, hey, listen, my wife, I love a clean house. Right, Michelle? I love a clean, neat house. And she lives with 3 men. So good luck with that one. Or you may say you love your pet. It doesn't matter. Now, the largeness of the love often depends on the largeness of the object, doesn't it? Right? So obviously you could say you love spaghetti, but you love your dog. Well, you probably love your dog if, unless you live on a farm. If you love your dog more than you love spaghetti. Or maybe you just like to eat and you love spaghetti more. But it's the largeness of the love, the largeness of the object determines the largeness of the love. Here's what I want you to know. God will use anything to get you started. Isn't it wonderful? Isn't it wonderful that you could be so small and yet you could have a love? You could love something. Because God will use anything to get you started on the path of everything. What's the path? It's love. Let me read to you again. Matt, you might want to write this down. Let me read to you again what Julian of Norwich said. She said, "Know it well. Love is the meaning." And who reveals this to you? Love. And what does he reveal? Love. Why? For love. Remain in this, and you will know more of the same. Now it may seem like, well, we have all these loves and a starter love, but don't these loves get in the way with, don't they compete with our love for God? Listen, God is not in competition with reality. God is who created reality. He's not in competition with reality. And so he knows in his wisdom that we need starter love. We need to get started in love. This is necessary. Think of it like this. In my house, I do have it now, but we didn't have city water. And so we have a cistern at my house. And so when the rain falls, it collects off the roof into the gutters, down the downspouts, into a holding area. Actually, it's a filtering area. It filters through sand and it goes into my cistern. And the cistern then comes into the house, right, through a pump. Well, when I moved in there and we were living there for a while, and I didn't know how big the cistern is. I didn't know how long it lasted. And one day, all of a sudden, we had no water in the house. And so I called Pete up, and Pete came over. We started looking at the pump. Thought maybe I had to change some things on the pump and so forth. We tried that, didn't work. And then Pete said, because I didn't grow up with a cistern. Pete grew up on a farm with a cistern. And Pete said, well, I think you're out of water. I said, out of water? And so we kind of went over to my cistern, and lo and behold, we were out of water. And so I had already got water coming into my house. I just haven't got it hooked up yet. So we got a hose. We started filling up my cistern. Filled up for a couple hours, right, Pete? And filled up for a couple hours, went and turned on the pump, and the pump wouldn't work. And so Pete said, well, what we have to do is we have to prime it. And so we took off a cap, poured water into that pump, right? To get it going, to get the suction going so it would start pumping water through the house. So think of the loves that God has given us, the abilities that he's given us as starter love, as priming the pump that we can then learn to love God. And all of these loves, now hear me, all of these loves are part of the effort for us to find the source of true love. It's like the water we put into the pump. The water we put into the pump was just a little bit of water. It was to prime it so we could do what? So we could access the source where all the water is. And so is the starter love that we experience in our lives. It's to prime the pump, the desire to, when you experience love, isn't it a great sensation? To love, to be loved. And as great as it is, we know that even that can hurt sometimes. But it's to prime the pumps for true love. Let me read to you a couple things. Now, if we have ever experienced human love to the point of sacrifice, forgiveness, and generosity, if we have never, are you with me? If we have never experienced love to the point of sacrifice, forgiveness, and generosity, it's going to be a lot harder for us to access, imagine, or experience God's kind of love. Now we're getting into what agape love is. Agape love. And what we're going to try to talk about today is, how do we understand agape love? How do we understand divine love? So if you haven't in your human life experienced love to the point of sacrifice, I think if you're a parent, it's easy. You can start to understand that one a little bit. The things we sacrifice kind of for our kids. Sacrifice, forgiveness. If you haven't experienced love in that way, in forgiveness or generosity, it's going to be hard to access, imagine, or experience God's kind of love. Now, the other side of this same coin is this. Listen. If you have never let God love you in the deep and subtle ways that God does, it's going to be hard for you to know the love of another human being in the deepest way in which we are capable of knowing. It's a paradox, isn't it? It's a paradox, yet it exists. To know one is to know the other the other is to know the one. Love is constantly creating future possibilities for all concerned. Even and eventually when things go wrong. Because love accommodates for everything in our human experience, both good and bad. And frankly, nothing else can do this but love. Nothing else can. Love flows unstoppably. Is that a word? Unstoppably. I hope it is. I wrote it down there. It must be a word. Unstoppably downward. Right? It's kind of like water. Right? Water doesn't flow up, does it? You need a pump. Like in my house, I have that pump down in the basement. It has to pump water up because water doesn't naturally go up. Water goes down. So I read this. Listen, love and water do not seek a higher place, but always a lower place. Just let that just sink in for a minute. Love always seeks the lower place like water. That's why forgiveness is most often or one of the most powerful ways that love is displayed in action. Forgiveness. Because when you forgive, what are you doing? Well, first off, you're acknowledging that there's something that in fact needs to be forgiven. There's something to forgive. There's a mistake. There's a hurt. There's a wound. There's an error. But instead of going to survival mode, right? Which was all done, right? Go to survival mode. We choose to release the offending party from any need of punishment or recrimination. Now listen, in doing this, what are we doing? In doing this, we are bearing witness to the ever-risen, ever-loving Christ. And so what I really want to talk about is this. I want to talk about when the Bible says that we're to take up our cross. Take up our cross. Did you ever think about that? Do you ever spend time, I'd like you to do that, spend time just kind of ruminating on that. See, when we have unforgiveness, we are living in the past. the old storylines, remembering hurts, and we're ever increasing our claims to victimhood. Let me read something else to you. This is from a book that I'm reading right now. It says, the crucified and risen Christ uses the mistakes of the past to create a positive future, a future of redemption instead of retribution. He does not eliminate or punish the mistake. He uses them for transformative purposes. People formed by such love are indestructible. Forgiveness might just be the very description of what God's goodness engenders in humanity. I told you this Easter I looked back at all my sermons that I preached, and I went over them. I think they were good. I mean, we talked about resurrection. We talked about what it means. We looked at it. We looked at the historical significance of it and all of that. But one thing that I noticed that I didn't do is that I didn't talk about the love. Oh, I mentioned it because we always kind of throw that in there, right? But when I started to think about it this Easter, is that love is what it's all about. So last week, if you were here last week, I'm glad that you were here. If you weren't, I would highly recommend that you go back and you watch the sermon from last week. Because one of the things we talked about last week was this idea, is that we have been endowed with certain powers. We've been endowed with the power to know and the power to love. And as great as both of those are, there's weakness in the power to know. And the idea was this, that we can't come into relationship with God by the power to know. So this morning I came in early and I went to my office and I was, like I've been doing every day, trying to practice kind of contemplative prayer. And I sat in my office for about 45 minutes and just sat there on my desk with my eyes closed, just trying to enter into a space where it was just God and me. And frankly, it's always difficult for me. It takes me a good 10, 15 minutes just to settle myself down, stop thinking about myself. And usually I try to come back to a word. And so today, the word that I came back to was really just the name of God. And I was focusing on just my breath, because the name of God is Yahweh. And if you were here a couple weeks ago, we talked about that, how Yahweh is sort of like this inhale, exhale. Yahweh. And so I sat there. And one of the things that I've been experiencing, and I talked about last week, was this idea that when we press into God, it's as though God takes a step back. And if you read the Psalms and you read through the Old Testament, what you find is you find this sense, you find this idea or this thought or this experience, I'll put it that way, this experience that these Old Testament writers, the psalmists have, is they talk about, God, where are you? Now we might think of that as in terms of that God is not there. But if you understand Scripture properly, you know that God can't be not there because God is everywhere. So he cannot not be somewhere. And so, but this idea that, God, where are you? This idea that I long for you and I want you. Now, as I was in kind of this morning, just kind of in this time of contemplative prayer, one of the things that kept coming up in my life were things that I needed. Now listen, pay attention. It's not that God doesn't want to provide you with things that you need and you desire and you even want. Now hear me. This is in the first 15 minutes, as these thoughts were coming, that I had certain needs, God showed me something. This idea of stepping back and drawing me in closer. And here's the point. The point is this, is that when I'm giving the thing that I'm asking for, when I'm given that thing that I'm asking for, my focus shifts, doesn't it? What's it shift to? It shifts to the thing that I receive. And the thought that came to my mind is my desire should be for love. That's it, love. Which is Him. Because when I desire something else, and God, out of His love, just like a parent does, out of their love, gives that good gift. And the trouble is our focus changes from desiring the giver and the love to the gift that we are given. That's why I said something last week that I didn't get a chance to explain, and you may have had trouble with. I was saying that when we seek when we're seeking Him and we have feelings of bliss or feelings of euphoria or experience healing, how those can be distractions. Because it takes our attention away from the one, from Him, from love. And from moving into that experience of love. And so we talked about this book, the Cloud of Unknowing. How when we press in, it's as if God steps back. And it may feel, and maybe you've experienced this, maybe you've experienced time when you've tried to connect in that way. And I don't mean this in a well, I'll just use the word, in a mystical way, right? And what I mean by that is, when we talk about mystics of old, these are people, men and women, who knew God experientially, not from the power to know. I confess to you, most of my life, most of what I called relationship with God has been built upon the power to know. And what I talked about last week is, listen, now, necessary step along the way, but it's also necessary to leave that behind, to transcend that. This power to know will only help you to enter into and use the power of love to have experience with God. I'll read it to you what I said last week. Every rational creature, every person, every angel has two main strengths, the power to know and the power to love. God made both of these, but God is not knowable through the first one. The power to love, however, God is entirely known because a loving soul is open to receive God's abundance. So as you start to understand, you start to realize, well, it makes sense that the only way to know love is through love, the power of love, not through knowledge. So if I was talking to, I forget who I was talking to this week, maybe it was Carl. I was saying, if I sat down, or it was Pete maybe too, if I sat down with somebody and I talked about Michelle, and they were saying, oh yeah, your wife she's lovely and she's beautiful and she's this and that, and we talked all about Michelle's qualities and her character and her nature. All that would be true, and I could feel a certain feeling towards her by that conversation. Isn't that true? But the only way for me to have relationship with her is to leave the conversation and to engage in relationship with her. If all I do time after time is spend talking about and even taking different ideas that I talk about her and going deeper into those ideas and studying those ideas and then talking to someone else about those ideas and teaching somebody about those ideas, I may have the illusion, the fantasy that I have a relationship with her. Does that make sense? And that relationship, and this is what I said last week, and I didn't get time to explain it, that relationship is purely imaginary. It's imaginary. It's not relationship. Now, another kind of side note to this, I want to explain something to you. This is very, very important. There is one God. There is one God. There are not many gods. There are not other gods. You cannot worship a false god. You can worship an idol. You can't worship a false god. There's only one. A false god would imply that there's other gods, but they're not true. There's only one God. Only one God can be worshiped. Only one God can be loved. And the Bible tells us when you love, you're living in God. It makes sense, doesn't it? Because He is love. God is incomprehensible to our intellect. Okay? Did you hear me? God's incomprehensible to our intellect. Now, all of you should have the same question. Then why do we come here week after week and you try to explain Him to us? If He's incomprehensible. That's why the Bible over and over again uses what? Metaphor, uses parable. Even Jesus said, well, okay, what's God like, or what's the kingdom like? It's kind of like a mustard seed. You mean the kingdom's a mustard? No, it's not a mustard seed. I can't have the word, so I got to use something that you kind of understand. And so we do the same thing. What's God like? Well, He's kind of like a father. Oh, so He's a father. Well, yeah, but he's kind of like a mother too. Really, so He's a father, mother. Well, yeah, but he's kind of like a strong tower. Well, what is He like? Yeah, I'm trying to explain to you what He's like. He's like all these things. Because He's incomprehensible to our intellect. Nobody's mind is powerful enough to grasp who God is. So why do we spend our time trying to do that? Why do we spend our time trying to argue about who has the correct definition of what He's like and who He is? We can only know God by experiencing God's love. One of the great things about God is this, that God indwells us. God does not push from without. How many have experienced that in church? A pushing from without. Pushing you somewhere. This idea that it's towards God, but you feel like you're being pushed. I want you to understand something. If you feel like you're being pushed, that's not God. Because where does He dwell? He dwells within. God draws from within. And so where do we find Him? Do we find Him from without? No, we find Him from within. That's why we have to turn in. That's why we have to spend time. Listen, if you are talking to somebody about God, it's safe to say that you are not experiencing God at that moment. Now, it's not to say that after time and you learn how to experience the presence of God. I think that as I look at people, different people throughout history, as I even see people through the Bible, I think you can come to a place where it's so real all the time that you can experience God all the time. Paul said, I'm praying continually. Now, if you understand prayer to be a time when you're sitting asking, requesting God for things, you're thinking, well, how can you pray all the time? But if you're thinking of prayer in terms of an intimacy and experience with God, you can pray all the time. all the time. So we talked about love and how his love draws us from within. And what it does, it moves us then, with what it should do, it should transform us and move us from, talked about this last week, move us from me to we. Constantly expanding our circle of love, ever expanding. And what kind of love is this? What typifies this love? Well, let me read it to you. It says this: you have heard that it was said, Jesus said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven, who causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. In another passage of Scripture, it says this: if you love those who love you, what good is that? What reward will you have if you love those who love you? And then he goes on to say something that kind of can slip by us. He goes, don't even the tax collectors do that? You understand who the tax collectors were? They were the lowest of the low. They were Jewish Roman sympathizers who would extract taxes from their fellow countrymen, right, for the Romans, and then they would take portion for themselves. They kind of played both sides. Listen, he said, those people, even tax collectors, who you hate, don't they even love those who love them? No, the Maundy Thursday message of love is to love all. Since we've been raised to new life with Christ, we set our sights differently on the realities of heaven, a heaven that exists right here and right now. And he tells us, think about the things of heaven, the things of God, not the things of earth. And he says, for you have died to this life, and your real life is hidden with Christ in God. We've died to this life. What does that mean? Well, we're obviously still alive. We've died to the idea of what this world tells us, that how we respond to hate, how we respond to evil. Isn't it true? Listen, this is the message of the gospel. This is the good news. The good news is this, is that love is the answer because God is the answer. Love is the only thing that can change humanity. Love is the only thing that can change this world. And so it's a different way to live. He's saying, listen, and if you understand, when Jesus left this world, he said, how many remember saying this at church? My peace I give you, my peace I leave with you. Not as the world gives. Not as the world gives. How do we give peace? How do we maintain peace? The world, I mean. How does the world do it? Well, the world does it by might, by strength, by power, by force, by violence, by the threat of violence. That's how the world keeps or maintains peace. Whoever has the bigger gun. And Jesus said this. Jesus said, no, there's actually a different way. There's a different way. And it's love. And it just sounds so impossible. It sounds so counterintuitive. Love. How can love be the answer? It's because he is love. And friend, this whole Easter time, so in your notes, in the back of your notes, I wanted you to write something down. I want you to write this down, is that, listen, let's stop just talking about the cross. Or maybe not just, we can still talk about it, right? Because we do. But let's start taking up our cross. Taking up our cross. Friend, forgiveness, let me tell you what forgiveness, when you truly forgive, what forgiveness is going to feel like to you. Forgiveness is going to feel like the passion of Jesus. Forgiveness is going to feel like suffering. Because what's suffering? Suffering is experiencing pain and hurt when you don't feel it's necessary. Why should I forgive? I'm the one who's wounded. And when I forgive, I don't want to forgive. I don't want, it feels like I'm letting them go. It feels like I'm letting them off the hook. But love is truly represented by our forgiveness. And so we take that step. We are first going to love God, and then we're going to love others. At the same time, we're going to love others so that we can love God. Listen, I want to be very clear about something, though, okay? I'm not talking about supporting or accepting terrorism, mass shootings. Because, listen, I know that's where your mind goes. All of our minds go there. Oh, yeah, but Jeff, that's kind of that's real lofty, and you know what I mean? But the truth is, and I'm not arguing against legal consequences for those kinds of actions. So just know I'm not talking about that. Forgiveness and love are a separate issue altogether. Separate issue altogether. And so what I want to ask you to do this Easter and for the rest of our lives is to begin to set aside time to press into God, to spend time in what we call contemplative prayer. It's good to come here and for us to meet together in a family and talk, but friend, you have to set aside time for your own personal experience with God. Listen, I understand exactly what you're thinking and what you feel. I mean, I talked to Michelle. Michelle said to me, Jeff, I struggle. Number one, our lives are so busy, right? Number two is, I don't want you to feel this way. I don't want you to feel like, so what I've been doing up till now has been a waste of time. You mean if that's what it is, then I'm just wasting my time? No, it's all part of our journey, friends. It's all part of our journey. Listen, you can't be led somewhere by somebody who isn't already there. I can't take you to a place, help you come to a place where I am not. Doesn't it make sense? Can't do it. So I'm on this journey with you. And I'm trying to do the very same thing. I want to know him. I want to experience him. And I've been trying so hard for the past 6-8 months. But so we were going to talk about a new sermon series about darkness, and I'm starting to understand why that came into my mind, but why I resisted it, because I'm understanding it's a difficult place to be. As you press in, you're going to experience the darkness. But I want you to understand something. He's there. He's there. He's in the darkness. And if you're experiencing a time of darkness right now, I want you to understand, he's there. The Bible says there's no place you can go where he is not. No place you can go. So understand, when you experience that darkness, understand he's still there. He's drawing you ever deeper into himself. Let's stand. Can we just be quiet for about a minute? Just a minute? Just take some time and try to clear your thoughts from everything, from the rest of the today or anything. And just focus on maybe your breath right now, your inhale and your exhale. Yahweh. Let's spend a minute in silence. Dear God, we're grateful this morning for love. That this incomprehensible, unfathomable love that you have. That our mind is never going to be able to grasp. So God, help us to move into the experience of love. It can't be taught. It has to be experienced. God, help each of us in our own way, in our own personal, individual way, to experience that love with you so that we could truly live in love with you and live in love with others. God, may this be our one pursuit. May this be our only desire. May this be the most important thing that our heart longs for with you, is experiential love. As we leave this place today, may these thoughts be ever on our mind so that we can remember to draw close to you, because love's the meaning. We thank you for it in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Thanks, friends. Happy Easter. Have a great day. Oh yeah, don't forget the flowers. See Connie if you want to buy one, okay?